First, I should apologize. First time in 13 years I have not read a book and I am still attending a meeting. Anyway, announcements not much, honestly. During the course of the month, we will have to start planning for our November and December books, which means we would like to get them confirmed, which are the books by October beginning, giving us enough time to read them. I will set the ball rolling at the right time. Next round of elections. Other than that, what is this attendance? This used to happen in December, I agree. We used to have very thin attendance in December thanks to the Kacheri circuit, and in fact one particular year we even cancelled the show meeting because only 3 were willing to come. That happens in December, but this is not December. Anybody has any ideas, any clue why? Okay, these things happen, doesn't matter. We'll have more fun. It's not always bigger the better. Quite often the smaller is better.
Better chances.
Better chances.
Yeah.
Not in Lakshmi, but it's okay.
You write your house over to me. You write it.
Now, Rameshan sent us long review, come summary, come everything. I'll read it out. He rang me up just a minute before I walked in here. He said, you want me to come on telephone line and then read it out to you? I said, we don't have audio experts here to make you join the circuit. I'll read it out. This is by Rameshan. Mr. Pip by Lloyd Jones is set on a beautiful island paradise in the South Pacific known as Bougainville. Alas, this idyllic world is subject to prolonged misery and terrible conflict, violence and cruelty. The brutality described in the book is stunningly graphic and visceral and is juxtaposed in stark contrast to the descriptions of nature on this island paradise. There are 2 ethnic groups. One is the Redskins, who are not white but are lighter skinned Papuans. The other group are the Islanders, the skin black as the shining night. The Redskins want to exploit the Islanders and extract mineral wealth, while the rebels are trying to protect the natural resources. This sets up a prolonged armed conflict between the 2 groups, and unfortunately the civilian Islanders are caught in the middle. The Islanders are a contented, docile lot, happy with the mining jobs they held until the mines closed. They are happy with the bountiful ocean, the fertile land, the lush vegetation and their primitive life. But the outside world intrudes with its greed, with its religion and with its racist hierarchies. The lone white man on the island is Popeye, or Mr. Watts, who is married to an islander, an impressive figure named Grace, who was full of life but has now succumbed to depression. As the conflict escalates, all those who are able to leave the island. School closes, and the narrator of the story, Matilda, a 13-year-old child, describes the increasingly precarious nature of their lives. Their essentials are no longer available, and the conflict gets closer and closer to the village. Popeye, or Mr. Watts, who until then had only been known for wearing a red clown nose and for dragging his wife Grace around in a cart, suddenly steps into the breach. He, a lone voice, offers to teach the children, and he chooses to teach Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. The children find themselves transported to a different world through their reading of Dickens. They escape their uncertain existence and are transported to Victorian England, where they get to know Pip, make new friends and live vicariously. The children retell the stories to their engrossed families. Matilda takes Pip to heart. Her own father is absent, having migrated to Australia, where he is trying to fit into the white man's world. Caught in the war's crossfire, Matilda and her mother are unable to join her father. Matilda builds a shrine to Pip on the beach. Her mother Dolores is a hard-working, God-fearing individual who is not enamored of Pip's influence on her daughter's life. She is confounded that Mr. Watts has foisted a fictional character like Pip, one who is subversive and godless, on the children, but yet will not believe in the existence of the devil. The social order in the village begins to break down as the brutality of the war escalates and men and animals are slaughtered. There are rumors of reprisals and people have taken sides in the conflict. The villagers desperately wait for the outside world to come and help, but their hope is always betrayed. This conflict only took place in 1993. It was well documented. The Australian government collected statistics on how many people died. It was deemed to be the worst conflict in the Pacific after the Second World War. Yet the world did not care. A lot of people who read the book don't realize it's a true story to a certain extent. At least the backdrop is. The Redskins and the rebels both make their foray into the village at different times and destroy everything of value, including the villagers' lone copy of Great Expectations. In an attempt to recreate the book and burnish their own memories, all the children in the village, led by Popeye, recollect pieces of the book and create their own versions of Great Expectations in a notebook. At one point, Matilda says, "We have no mirrors, and it's only our rewriting of Great Expectations that holds a mirror to us." Unfortunately, the Redskins are misled into believing that Pip is a real person, and their febrile frustrations, compounded by malaria in not being able to find him, leads them to commit terrible acts of atrocity. Mr. Watts is shot dead and fed to the pigs. And because Matilda's mother and her classmate Daniel have the courage to say that they witnessed the murder, they too are killed and disposed of in a similar horrific manners. Matilda, though numbed by the witnessing the violence of her mother's death and that of her classmate Daniel, manages to flee the island, heroically clinging to a log of wood, and is reunited with her father. A happy reunion, and at least for her father there is a happy ending where he finds another woman to replace Matilda's mother in his heart. Matilda too gains a sincere and well-meaning stepmother, but she is not ready to allow the stepmother to take her mother's place. The story is about Matilda maturing into an adult and gaining more nuanced understanding of the people around her. Mr. Watts himself is a complex personality who loses his wife Grace during one of the incursions by the soldiers. He offers to take Matilda with him in an attempt to leave the island, but Matilda later suspects that he would have left her and gone alone. This book is all about the power of imagination to drive dreams. Popeye's wife leaves the island and tries to make her way in a different cultural environment, marries Popeye, but eventually returns home after suffering the loss of her only child. Matilda herself imagines a starkly different life outside the island through the voice of Pip and acts upon it, only to feel homesick and lost at the end of the book. And she plans to return to her island. This book is a migrant story. The idea of home, the dissatisfaction with home, the search for a new home once the old one becomes untenable, and the possibility of even the probability of a return. The book is about heroism, loyalty, betrayal, human greed, vengeance, and ambition. Matilda comes to realize that even Mr. Watts has many imperfections and many dimensions to his character, not all of which are appealing. He too was capable of betrayal. He abandons his first wife when he falls in love with Grace, and is a consummate actor, leading Matilda to wonder if his reading of Great Expectations was sincere, or if he was just playing a part that he had imagined for himself. In summary, this was a short book but hefty in its emotional content and thematic range. Not always a happy book, but ultimately the message is hopeful and optimistic. I cannot wait to watch the movie.
I recently read the book, and I found it somewhat like a white man's apology. A white New Zealander, I think he's a Kiwi. Okay, he's nearby. This is his apology that, as to the end of this, I mean, sometimes it doesn't occur to us that we are in a new century, right? Yeah, we are in a new century, so we are in the 90s. This happened in the 90s, as late as the 90s. I was in Australia at that time, and I know the news reports. And there were many of these apologists. There are many of these sincerely white apologists. Now, this man is a New Zealander, so he's brought a bit of autobiographical, because he would have read all the news reports of that time. It's a brilliant novel. It's 10 years old, the novel. And he's further put a bit of he's obviously a student of Dickens as well. And I feel he patronized these people who were just ignored. See, actually, the timeline is when the white man came and he industrialized a bit of that island, and everybody was happy. Because one generation before, earlier, again, white people went and evangelized that area, because all these people are Christians. They're not literate, but they are Christian. You can see the Christian theme when, one thing Rameshan, he overlooked was when the book is missing, Popeye Watts invites people, the children, to bring their parents in, and the parents give a very evocative, innocent, childish acceptance of the universe around them. And every now and then we are reassured, all their belongings are burnt. Then the second incursion, the houses are burnt. Yet these people are so confident that they can survive, because all they needed, living next to a first world. Australia is barely a few kilometers down. Very few of them do go to Australia, but quite these like froggies in the well. They're quite happy in their own. They're open to other people taking over. See, they were ripe. The white people have distanced themselves. There's a lot of anarchy, and the rebels are the children, the boys. She very poignantly narrates that the boys all have gone and joined the rebels because they know they're doing. They got absolutely no outside. In fact, he's the only white man, and he's the instigator, and he's on his last legs. I feel he was already ill, and I don't know why he goes. He's one of those white residuals, as we say. Australia is full of old English people. In my 35 years in Australia, I met a lot of old English people who will talk. And earlier in Calcutta, I met a lot of old British people who stayed on in India. And they were running these B&Bs, the first B&Bs, you could stay in Calcutta, and an old English lady will come and give you muffins in the morning. And then she'll talk about the good old days. And she's apologizing for, I have a feeling, she could have easily gone back to England, but she's Indian. She's born in India, married to an Indian-born Westerner, and he's died of dengue or some killing Indians and getting killed by Indians or whatever, for king and country, right? So this is when, so I have a feeling this book has been written with that angle. If you look at it, that's why it's so appealing to other people. All around the world it's appealing, because many apologists, white apologists, will love this book, because they know this happened in their doorstep. It was a big seller in Australia, I remember. But there are so many books like this, if you really look, when you can transport yourself to a place where people have nothing, and you are a guy with everything, like Watts has everything. And at random he picks up this book about Pip, and how Pip's dilemma comes out through this girl Matilda and her formidable mom Dolores, very well drawn character, how tough she is. And on the whole, it was a psychologically upsetting book. But that's the way of the life. I mean, history is bound to repeat itself. See, the Americans are not interested to go into Ukraine today because they don't want to lose their troops. So it's echoed the same way. Australia didn't bother to go. PNG, Papua New Guinea, was just another footstep to think. People who really want to survive can. The guys who really made money was the 18th, 19th and 20th century people who put up the mining and all that. And then when the trade union started and a bit of capitalism was on the outside, they let the natives fight amongst themselves. But one generation before, you must not forget that PNG helped the Australians defend their country against the Japanese. But what were they done? They were just done by these, they were just cast aside. So it's written with a very first world slant at how these people live. Today the Aborigines live in Australia like this. No one cares, but at least they have money. But white people write, I'm using the word white quite often, but it's a very wide slant, I felt. And it's a beautiful story. Anyone who likes Dickens will relate to it. And how he brings out the interest to children who are in that stage when they are living in a horrible situation. But they accept it. The whole book is about acceptance. When you are not literate, when you are nothing, when you have nothing and you are nothing, you end up nothing unless you step like Matilda. Matilda got inspired by the books which was read out to her, and actually Dolores actually hit the book in the rafters. That's another thing. So Dolores, such a strong traditional Christian mom, illiterate mom, even she felt that Pip had to be, but nowhere to hide it. She hid it in the rafters in some, in a mat, in her husband's, in a mat, and then it got burnt anyway. But this story about a bully, that guy in the graveyard, I forget the book, actually, how this chap bullied this little Pip to feed him, and Pip went home, and then he goes to that old lady who's waiting. So there's a lot of disappointment in the book itself. It's one of the most boring books. Not boring. We had it in college, so we had to read it. So it's a very depressing book, like Rameshan said. It's a very, very depressing book. But I felt it's a Westerner's apology, and it was not a joyful book like that guy who wrote on Botswana, the guy who wrote about the number one ladies detective. That was a joyful book. That was sweet. But that was also patronizing because the guy was white and he was a male. Here he is another guy, white, and he is male, and he's stepped into the shoes of a mother and her daughter. The mother-daughter relationship is nice. It'll make a good movie, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you. That's my assessment.
For those who are not here, this is just to say we miss you very much, and you're missing a spectacular show over here. We are surrounded by hordes of Ravi Varma paintings. It is a treat to the eyes, it's assailing the senses, and frankly, it's not making it easier to talk about a book. There's also a lovely tea, so boo sucks to you, those who couldn't come. Now for the book, which I read many months ago, and I'm trying to dredge my memory. The very fact that we are members of a book club, Anand, will you please stop jiggling around? Thank you. Okay. For the very fact that we are members of a book club, and is that we love books. And I don't think there's any of us here or those who are listening who will say that they have not entered a book at least once in their lives. For me, it was Louisa Alcott with Little Women and Good Wives, and more recently, the Hogwarts, Harry Potter. Okay, and this is what this book is about. Matilda enters Charles Dickens' world, and it has a glorious impact on her. The first thing we see is an island, and we presume that this Papua New Guinea, before the whites came and exploited it, was a self-sufficient country where people lived with their own code of ethics and lived happily with whatever nature produced. And then we find the white men coming and introducing them to a white life, and things changed. It led to civil war, and a lot of horrors followed. This civil war is very much part of the book because both grown-ups and little children see horrors that nobody should ever see. But I'd like to drift away from that and talk only about the story. I enjoyed the book thoroughly because it is a story within a story, and yet there's a third story. So that's the structure of the book. The first is, of course, the narrative that Matilda speaks and tells us her story, and her identification and her close dive into Great Expectations. The second story is Great Expectations itself, as Mr. Watts puts it, which we learn later is an abridged, condensed, and maybe a slightly or quite likely a very different version from Charles Dickens. He has taken away a lot of Dickens, we learn later. The third and probably smallest story is that what we learn about Mr. Watts in the end and his wife, that they were actors, which left me with the question, how much of Mr. Watts that we see inside the classroom was Mr. Watts, and how much of it was the actor? Did he really act because he had a spellbound audience of young minds in front of him? It is very natural to step into the role of an actor then. And an actor can always give a different perspective of the same script. So the structure of the book is absolutely fascinating. The next is the language. The simplest of simple languages that a child can write, because although it's a flashback, it's the flashback of what a child has seen. There are no great metaphors. The similes that are used, and there's so many beautiful ones, are all taken from nature, because nature had the greatest impact on their little lives, which is so beautiful to see. So people are like clumped bananas. Somebody slides by like I think I'm saying this wrong, but to me it sounded like a diaper fish. Maybe the word is not diaper, but anyway, everything is taken from nature. When they're stripped of everything, they said, so what? We have fruits on the trees, we have a river for water, and we have fish in the sea, as long as Gilbert's father's boat goes to sea. So the language is by no means profound, but incredibly touching, and takes us to a place that I'll never ever go to. I switch to characterization now, and here it's a tour de force of the author. We have Mr. Watts, Matilda, of course, the narrator, which we'll come to. We have Mr. Watts and Matilda's mother, Dolores. Mr. Watts is quiet, dignified, and we find later in the story he's noble, but he is what he calls a true gentleman. He never says that about himself, but he defines what a gentleman is for his students. A gentleman will always do the right thing. Point 2, a gentleman will never forget his manners. And this is Mr. Watts right up to the end, even when he's taken away to be wickedly hacked. The second very powerful character, of course, is Matilda's mother, who is a joy to us, utter joy. She's feisty, she can be nasty, she can put up a brave front. She has stood the test of time without her husband. She looks out to sea wistfully, knowing that her husband is on the mainland, but has lived a good moral life, and she is a fierce antagonist to Mr. Watts. The irony is that both of them are actually very similar. Both of them are strongly moral people and have a very strong code of ethics. It's just that Mr. Watts doesn't have a Bible, and Dolores clenches one to herself every given moment of the time. I found that a beautiful parallel. We have Matilda, a young child who literally grows up, blooms under Mr. Watts' tutelage. She sees her island and herself stripped of everything that we would think of as necessary. They're stripped of their dignity, their possessions, even the right to live at some point. And what are they left with when their homes are burnt and their possessions are gone? They're left with their dignity, which the islanders hold strong. And they said, let's get back to work. And within a week, the houses were all built. And thanks to Mr. Watts, the children are left with their imagination. That won't desert them, come what may. This is the Matilda that we see who is obsessed with Pip, who learns from him, who has great expectations, who dislikes Estella because Pip likes him. She is growing up. This is the Matilda we see who talks of her mother being raped and she being saved from being raped. And how is it all done? There's a very detached tone throughout the book. It's written, of course, as a flashback, but emotion doesn't step in. Without making a big deal about it, we feel for these children, we see them, we live with them, we enjoy it. And that's where the power of language is fantastic. And last point on language is, why do we see the language is so important? Because Mr. Watts reads Great Expectations. They don't even understand for a few weeks what's going on. It's just the pure sound of language. And that is everything to them. And the last part of it, she of course meets her father, she goes to London, she visits all the Dickensian sites, she does her thesis on Dickens, and at the end of it all, she is left disappointed because the Dickens she had known on the island is not the Dickens that lived. Yes, physical features, check. Long straggly beard, check. Twinkling eyes, check. But Dickens himself was not a nice person. He threw out his children at a young age out into the world to seek their fortune. So the man who wrote it, the man who she had come, if I may use the word, to love, or rather his creation that she had loved, is a disappointment to her. And this is where I feel Matilda really, really grows up. And I hope all the wonderful expectations that she has comes to this lovely fictional character. Thank you.
You want to read dreams?
So I too did not write it down, so I'm speaking from memory. My impressions of this book, I won't say what the stories are about because Lakshmi and the speakers before me have done an amazing job, so you know what the storyline is. I'll talk to you about my impressions of the book. So when I started reading this book, I thought, wow, this man is an amazing storyteller, probably on par with the last one we read, Abraham Verghese, because the story was told in such an easy way that it sort of mesmerized me into wanting to read more. Then because I didn't read it in one stretch, I set it aside and came back to it. I had time to think in between, and I'm thinking, God, what a depressing book. Mixed in with, when people are stripped of everything, what do they have to keep them going? And it's the power of their imagination. And this is the crutch that Watts gave Matilda, and indeed all of the islanders. So that was interesting. It's sort of like I had a conflict in my mind about this beautiful island paradise where such wickedness happens on a regular basis. And so that was a little tough. I thought there was gratuitous violence. I didn't really appreciate because it was too startling for me. Life is going on an even but, horrific pace. All of a sudden these rebels come over, drag Watts off to shoot him, and then sort of like draw and quarter him and feed it to the pigs. But that was not enough gratuitous violence, I suppose. So this poor little girl, 13-year-old, watches her mum being raped, and mum bargains with her life. And so what does she have to witness? She has to witness the same behavior meted out to her mum, being killed, or being raped, being killed, being drawn, quartered, and fed to the pigs. I did not like that. It was too startling. It was way too startling, and I felt it was gratuitous violence. It could have been done differently. And I started thinking, now how does somebody who is subject to so much horrible, horrific experiences, how does one actually come out of it and survive and continue to live? I thought the author did an amazing job of describing how Matilda got swept off by the river and struggled and, sort of saved herself and comes back to, land, etc. And the language is just fantastic. There were so many times when I said, I wish I had a pen, I would have written this down, because the phrasing was just amazing. And then she goes off to live with her father, and then the rest of the life is like per normal. You would expect an Australian immigrant to sort of live this kind of a life, and she gets a job and so on and so forth. But to me, the melancholy, the sheer sadness, the horrible nature of predators or conquering masses or whatever, it really was written in such an emotionally perturbing manner. I couldn't shake that out. And so even though that book sat on my bedside table after I finished reading it, and I picked it up to say, let's see if I can read it again, because I think, Lakshmi, you said you were rereading the book. I started reading it. I had the same exact experience all over again. I read the first 20 pages, really enjoying it. Like, wow, this is wonderful. I had to think long and hard about why I didn't like this book. I didn't like it because of the emotional trauma it inflicted on me personally. I found it really, truly perturbing. The author is very skilled at writing. His command of the language is fantastic. He has some amazing phrases that are worth repeating or highlighting for sure. But the story itself was all about the worst of human nature and human beings' ability to overcome the worst possible stuff by escaping into a different that realm that books offer. And so it made me appreciate all over again why we all love reading books, because it is an escapism. It allows you to escape the reality of your present circumstances and live somebody else's life and see what they were doing. And in this case, Dickens and escaping into the 18th century England was possibly educational as well, because how else is this kid going to learn about life in those times? So lots of good positive things in this book, lots of horrific, emotionally battering kinds of experiences in this book, and to me it's the latter that stayed with me. And so I didn't like this book for those reasons. It took me a long time to just get over the emotional trauma that I inflicted on myself by reading this book. I didn't like the book in total. I mean, I liked the artifacts in the book. I liked the language. I liked the description. I liked, individual elements of the book. I didn't like the story because of, he could have done such a superb job with the premise. How books actually offer escapism from the world's most constraining, difficult circumstances. That would have been done. But I thought that having a 13-year-old child watch first her teacher being drawn and quartered and fed to the pigs and her mother subject to the same thing was unnecessary violence. And how do you actually go through something like that? 13 is a very impressionable age. She escapes to her father, and all of a sudden life is like on an even keel. She goes to school and she goes to college and she gets a job and all of this stuff. And at that point, linkages back to Dickens was also gratuitous. I didn't think he treated that placing of Dickens in her life, he didn't do that treatment enough justice.
This is Prem Kishore's review of Pip. A story within a story. All the more fascinating to me as I had studied Great Expectations with total dislike in high school. Miss Havisham was a nightmare. Estella's arrogance was despicable. The convict frightening, and Pip's relations were oddballs. But Pip himself fascinated me with his frailties, confusion, and innocence. And now I confront the story again 60 and odd years later in the book by Lloyd Jones, simply called Pip. And the main black character, Matilda, is at home in a white skin, Pip. There is a disarming simplicity about this book with lovely village language. The classroom says Mr. Watts, the sacrificial lamb in the story, is a place of light. A phrase that still resonates in my ears as I have been a teacher for decades. Along with the 13-year-old narrator Matilda, I became attached to Pip all over again. Loyalty, sacrifice, and compassion come into play, and unlike the unsettling ending in Great Expectations, this slim volume Pip has a happy ending. What is astonishing and stunning is that reading Charles Dickens saves the young students in the village from the daily horror and conflict in their lives. What disturbed and repelled was the island, which was ravaged by a brutal and bloody civil war as recently as 1990. I should not be surprised. Headlines today still bring us horror stories of uprisings and massacres around the world. Yes, for me, Pip is an extraordinary book of fiction and reality.